Hello, it's Dr. Kowalczyk again. I appreciate you being patient as I try to learn some of the nuances of running this course online. Things are going to hopefully start coming fast and furious, but with plenty of time. Also, if you haven't seen your grades yet, don't panic. They're coming. Again, I'm trying to learn Moodle and how to transfer those grades. This should be coming up, should be posted right away. You should have two assignments in. This will be the third assignment along with this lecture and video. The lecture now is the legacy of the barbarian invasions. I ended last time. You may have noticed that your notes in your last one ended on point three. Just ignore point three. And I've redone the lecture outline for lecture three, and it'll be attached, and you just do the notes through that lecture. And that should be um, keep you up to date, and you'll hopefully have another lecture by tomorrow or Thursday. I keep promising that, but hopefully it'll come soon. Again, just stay patient, and everything will be made abundantly clear. So what I want to talk about today is the legacy of the barbarian invasions. Remember, the entire theme and purpose of this course is not for you to know a bunch of facts and dates. Those are important, but really the theme is for you to understand um, things that may have made it into the modern world. What are the foundations of our worldview? And in that regard, there are some very important lessons, or a legacy, if you will, from the barbarian invasions. Now, I am assuming that most of you have no idea what I'm talking about when I say the barbarian invasions. I alluded to it last time. I kind of skipped over it. And it begs the question, what are the barbarian invasions? So Rome was a massive empire. It spread throughout northern Africa, um, what is today the Middle East, and into Europe, all the way up into Rome, all the way up into France, all the way up into what is Germany. And its massive empire, on the borders of its massive empire, were numerous nomadic tribes of peoples, and they varied. And these tribes were essentially from all over, um, basically everywhere ever the Roman Empire was, and anybody who was outside the Roman Empire was called a barbarian. Now, beginning in the late 300s and 400s, that's 300 plus years after Christ, some of these tribes began to invade the Roman Empire. Now, at first, these were just local raids. These barbarians, these outsiders, began to move into the Roman Empire and what we call sacking of cities, or basically a looting of cities. These tribes were nomadic. They were warlike. Everything you can think of as a stereotype of a barbarian, an individual, long-haired, barbaric, if you will, in hides and big, bulky warriors, bloodthirsty warriors, etc. A lot of those stereotypes are more associated with the Vikings who come later, but the barbarians were warlike individuals, and they were nomadic tribesmen, and their soldiers would come into a place of wealth, a Roman city, and steal everything that wasn't tied down. They'd murder or kill anybody they viewed as a threat. These were small raids at first, but then eventually these tribes began to come into the Roman Empire, and long story short, they realized that the Roman Empire was disintegrating, and they began to take over major cities. Eventually, the fall of Rome, the city of Rome itself. And there's lots of complex reasons for this, not the least of which is many of these tribes fought amongst themselves. They weren't entirely united. Um, for example, the two most famous tribes are perhaps the Goths and the Huns. They fought continually. And the Goths were so big, they were broken up into Ostrogoths and Visigoths. That means Eastern Goths and Western Goths. And they were fighting with the Huns. You may have heard of Attila the Hun, who was a famous warrior who united the Huns. Today, the name Hungary exists because that's where the Huns eventually settled. Um, so, in other words, these tribes began to grow and be massive, and they began to take on the Roman Empire. As Roman Empire weakened, these barbarian invasions came in and took over parts of the Roman Empire. And when we say take over, what is unique here is they didn't establish empires like Rome. They were nomadic warriors who were loyal to local tribesmen. In many cases, these tribesmen or these leaders were not, they didn't pass on to their heirs their control of the tribe. It went for whoever was the next in line. And these tribes would often disappear. or they would be weakened enough that they had to retreat and go somewhere else. Uh, and so, in other words, many times these barbarians just came in, took the wealth of a city, took what was needed and necessary, and then moved on to somewhere else. And so, what began to happen is these various tribes on the outside of the Roman Empire just came in waves. And I put a map on. You have to see it in color to open it up. When you open it up in Word, you can see all the various tribes over about a 400-year period that came in and invaded Rome. Now, it's important you understand this was the western half of Rome. What is today Italy? What is today France? What is today Britain? What is today basically Europe? Um, are the direct result of the barbarian invasions. Many of the name places of Europe come from these barbarian invasions. As I mentioned, Hungary, Lombardy, and Italy are just a few of the places. There are many other places that take on barbarian names because that's where the tribes eventually settled. They came in, took what they wanted, and then they just said, "Hey, this is a good place to settle," and their tribes settled there. So even genetically, the descendants to this day from those regions are go all the way back to the barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire. All right. So if you want a strict, straight definition, the barbarian invasions are a wave of outsiders who take slow control over the Roman Empire in the western half in what is today Europe. Um, the consequences of this wave of um, invasions are incredibly significant, not the least of which is it splits the Roman Empire into geographically, the western half of the Roman Empire disappears entirely. The political social control from the city of Rome fades. Now Rome is still an important city, not the least of which is the church eventually chooses Rome as its capital. And that ends up becoming far more significant than the Roman emperor. As a matter of fact, there's a great debate on who the Roman emperor in the city of Rome is. Remember, Constantine had moved his empire to what it became Constantinople, to the city of Byzantium, renames it Constantinople. And so the Roman emperors had moved to the east, to the middle of the empire, and the west lost its emperor. And the only real political control anymore was the church. And so, in some cases, what becomes of the Western Empire is called the Roman Catholic Empire. Yes, it seems odd to say the Pope has an empire, but remember, St. Augustine's view was that there's the spiritual realm and there's the physical realm or the temporal realm, and that they should unite together. Well, the physical or the temporal realm, the emperor was over in the east, and the Roman Empire was split. Now, there's a geographical reason for this. Right in the middle are the Balkan Mountains. That's in what is today Serbia, what is today Croatia, north of Greece are these massive mountains. And so barbarians didn't have any desire to go over those mountains. It was rough, rugged terrain. They're nomadic, and for the most part, they stopped at that particular point and didn't invade the eastern half of the empire. Communication in this time was incredibly slow. It was incredibly difficult. It was dangerous. And so over time, while these barbarian invasions are happening, the Eastern Empire becomes its own empire. That empire became known as the Byzantine Empire. Now, I want you to understand, they still called themselves Roman. They still believe themselves to be truly Roman, and they believe themselves to be the legacy of Rome. But there's no denying that their political control was only in the eastern half of the empire. Again, I put up a map um, on your worksheet. Hopefully, you can see that in color. And that Byzantine Empire um, becomes its own separate entity. So geographically, the Roman Empire is split. The western half becomes Roman Catholic, and the eastern half is its own political entity called the Byzantine Empire, with its capital in Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire, which I'm going to talk about separately in another lecture, has an enormous legacy of its own. It's often overlooked. It's the forgotten empire in history because it eventually gets conquered by Islam, but it has enormous consequences for the rest of the modern world. And I'll talk more about that significantly. But for now, the most important thing is that you can make the argument that East meets West. Remember, in today's world, we have this whole argument about Eastern culture versus Western culture. That really begins at this point in time in history. with the split in the Roman Empire. They're all united under one idea, the Roman peace, and then the barbarian invasion split that empire in two. And Europe becomes Europe with a Roman Catholic spiritual Christian influence, and the Byzantine Empire maintains its Christian empire for a period of time, but then eventually is conquered by Islam. And so, the eastern half of the empire becomes much more Islamic, and its tribes develop completely separately as a direct result of all of this. So that's one of the most important things about the barbarian invasions is that geographic split across the board. Okay, now um, also I should help you understand a little bit about the Byzantine Empire. I'm going to talk about its own culture separately in a different lecture. But just so you know, the Byzantine Empire stretches from Greece, what is today Constantinople, in what is today Turkey, all the way down through the Middle East and most of into Asia, into northern Africa, and up into Bulgaria, into north of the Balkan Mountains. Uh, it has the Byzantine Empire maintains its empire all the way into the 1300s and 1400s until it's eventually completely overrun. Now, the Islamic invasions of the Byzantine Empire begin as early as the 700s. And for 500 years, the Byzantine Empire fights Islam. As a matter of fact, just a forerunner here, the Crusades were partially an effort by the western half of the empire to protect the Byzantine Empire. They were both Christian, and they both considered themselves kind of cousins to each other. And so the Crusades were an attempt to not only liberate Jerusalem but to protect the Byzantine Empire from Islam. Well, eventually Islam takes over the entire empire. It is a geographical feature. It is one political unit. That political unit does not disappear until after World War I in the 1900s. The Byzantine Empire is one massive administrative state. It's an administrative state under an emperor, but that emperor was really almost a figurehead. It was an enormous bureaucracy that sent enormous wealth to Constantinople. Constantinople is an underrated city, and its beauty and its majesty was heralded. It was the jewel of the medieval world for almost 1,000 years. And again, we have forgotten most of this because of that east-west split. But for a long period of time, many people in the medieval world considered Constantinople the heart of Christianity. Well, I mean, Rome was obviously the heart of Christianity in terms of Roman Catholicism, but as a whole, Constantinople was the jewel city. It was incredible wealth, and that administrative state practiced what we're going to talk about in a minute, feudalism, and did so remarkably well. There was a remarkable, I mean, there were always constant raids and there were always constant fighting, and there was always struggles for who was at the top. But for the most part, the agriculture, the economy, the trade with Asia, all the way up until the Mongol invasions, which we'll talk about in due course, it was remarkable how well run the Byzantine state was, and its successor states that kept the same political unity. Eventually, Islam takes over the Byzantine Empire and keeps almost all the same principles and same form of government. All right, so it's important that you understand that Byzantine Empire for future purposes. Um, okay, so that raises the question. Okay, we were talking about the barbarians and not the Byzantine Empire, but uh, what was the cultural legacy? Well, as I mentioned before, the barbarians were nomadic warriors. That warlike culture cannot be underestimated. Their allegiance to a leader, to a warrior, was somebody who could rally their men and fight and protect the tribe. In essence, and this is very important, these barbarians pledged themselves to a leader who could protect them. Now, that is a very small thing in terms of from our perspective. But if you really consider it, it is the root of feudalism. And I'll explain feudalism in a second. What it was a pledge. These warriors in a tribe would commit themselves to a leader who they believed could protect them. And in return, the leader got all the benefits. He would get all the monetary rewards. He was in power. He was powerful. In essence, he was the government. Most of these barbarians didn't have like things like the Roman governor, Roman Senate. They didn't have an election. They didn't necessarily have citizens. They were clannish. You belonged to a clan. They had their own. They had their own customs, their own rituals. But for the most part, they were organized around a warlike leader, and which is why they would rise and disappear because as their warriors were good, or if they had a bad warrior, or they get defeated, um, that was it. So so they had a warlike devotion to a leader, and then on top of that, they were nomadic. They moved all around, and it was not until late in the Roman Empire that they eventually began to settle down. They would find a place that they viewed as important, and they would sit there. That's why they have those name places to this day. Um, by the way, these are often called Germanic tribes because most of these tribes from the in the barbaric invasions of Rome came from what is today Germany, and they eventually spread. They had their legacy all the way through. Not the least of which, culturally, their influence on language is incredibly important. Latin was the dominant language, became the dominant language all the way into the Byzantine Empire, etc. Um, Latin was the language of educated individuals. But as the barbaric invasions happened, Latin began to become only for the elites, and more what we call vulgar or vernacular languages started to appear. The root of languages like Italian, which mixed with Latin, the languages like French, which mingled with Latin, languages like German, which didn't have much of a Latin influence, but those are barbaric languages. Even English, which mixes with Latin and German, and all of those things. Now, English is not a, I mean, mostly French and Italian are heavily influenced by Latin, which is why they're called the Romance languages, um, and Spanish as well. But for the most part, all of those have a heavy influence from the vernacular Germanic languages going across the board. Yeah. Also, culturally, um, the Germans had a strong tradition for family and rituals that eventually become Christianized. And that's kind of unique and weird. I mean, here they are, they're the conquerors of the Roman Empire. But what is very clear is that one by one, all of these warlike leaders began to convert to Christianity. There's a number of reasons for that. Helped unite the tribe. Um, in some cases, they get the blessing of the Pope in Rome that allowed them to live peaceably among other tribes, etc. The church certainly tried to convert as many barbarians as possible through missionaries. There's all kinds of stories of saints who went to missionary tribes and converted tribes, etc. St. Patrick might be one of the most famous, converting the Celts, converting the Irish. Um, all of that happens in this particular period of time. The influence of the church is significant, but many of the cultural elements of the barbarians remains. So, for example, the Christmas tree, um, many of the Christmas traditions, some of those traditions were all originally barbaric traditions. Now, by the way, that's a little bit overblown. Sometimes some people think that a lot of, I mean, things like the Easter bunny and Easter eggs and stuff like that are all stolen from barbaric cultures. That's not entirely true. Christian saints often use these to their own purposes. It's a story of conversion. Some of that gets way overblown. But it's no denying the fact that Christians use to their advantage Germanic traditions and barbarian traditions to tell a Christian story. They didn't have any problem doing so, and it just becomes part of the whole culture. But more importantly, their sense of um, being spiritual but also being warlike is combined. It's a very weird thing. On one hand, they become Christians and they're very spiritual. On the other hand, they still maintain this idea of a warlike state, that they're going to defend their culture. They're going to defend the roots of their clan. You could make the case that the idea of nationalism, which doesn't become popular until the 1800s, the word nationalism, the idea of a nation and a nation state slowly begins with the barbarians. Really, it begins with Rome, but the barbarians come in and they make it a matter of family. They make it a matter of a blood feud within the clan. The idea of a nation is one blood, one united thing. Now, by the way, there's no such thing as racism at this particular period of time. That word and that concept doesn't develop until the 1800s. But the idea of belonging to a group that is under one leader, under one united idea, one culture, whether and having somewhat of a spiritual culture, slowly begins to creep into this. And on top of that, these leaders begin to unite different clans together. And as they unite, the idea of a king, which existed in Rome, etc., but the idea of a European king who is uniting tribes, having ultimate political authority, starts to rise up in this. So you can see the roots of what becomes famous in the medieval, the idea of kings and nobles, etc., across the board. Um, Starts to rise up in this. So culturally, all of those things are true in terms of the barbaric invasions. Perhaps the most important development in all of this, everything I've been describing, really can be viewed under what is called feudalism. Now, feudalism has its own stereotype to this day. It often gets taught in high schools at the high about in the high Middle Ages when you're thinking of kings and queens. You're thinking of nobles and knights in shining armor, um, and and then peasants. If you've ever seen Monty Python, Search for the Holy Grail, the idea of feudalism is totally, parodied in that particular movie. You need to divorce yourself from all of this. Feudalism is really an economic and political structure that is born out of Rome, but eventually makes its way into barbaric cultures and then eventually becomes quite a distinct European system. It is an economic and political unity. I want to say that again. Feudalism is an economic and political unity. Um, and what I mean by that is, first of all, feudalism is a political entity where people give themselves or pledge themselves to a person who can provide protection. They give themselves to a government, if you will, that can provide protection. The responsibility of the person with that authority and that power is to protect the people. Now, eventually, what they do is they build castles so that people can move into the castles. They build, forts or fortifications, or in the case of the barbarians, they're warlike. They In some cases they become offensive. They go out and they take territories to provide for the people, or they fight tribes that are coming to fight them. But their job, their responsibility, is protection as warriors, as leaders, and individuals pledge themselves. Now, what I mean by pledge, meaning that they will work the land, they will grow crops, they will tend to what is necessary, what is needed, they will use their skills, and they will exchange that. It's not necessarily monetary, but they will provide for the community as long as they're being protected by those individuals. Some of those individuals would get what they need, they would get their food, they would get their, whatever it was, and they would take care of each other. Now, the warriors, the warlike leaders, also had to take care of their warriors, and which often cases means they gave them wealth or land. If they conquered a territory, the leaders would give back to the warriors land. Land was economic, it's what produced. So the people on the land would eventually become peasants or serfs, right? Would pledge themselves to a warrior. The warrior would fight for the leader. The leader would provide protection overall. Now, that's a political structure. The economic side of that is kind of hinted at that, is that in return for all of this, it would be somewhat of a, you know, a, I don't want to use the word communist or commune, but it would be a fair and free exchange. Cash and the idea of cash and paying for things in gold and silver doesn't come in well until the 800s, 900s, and it slowly develops all the way up until the 1800s. The idea of money and having wealth in that sense. Wealth was really about land, control of land, and providing crops, providing food and sustenance for people. People would work the land, they would have what they needed, and they would exchange it for protection and overall that was their government. Um, the idea of laws, the idea of jurisprudence, all of that was local custom. And it's not until later on that the king starts developing this idea of having a set number of laws in place. Really, it was just a matter of whatever the king decreed. And by the way, the king is at the top of this system. He's the one responsible for providing protection. It's what they eventually called kings. Um, and do the whole system was developed around personalities, if you will. It is a very loose system. It is not. It just becomes, like I said, custom and code. Um, yeah, you may be familiar with the idea of chivalry. That doesn't come until the 1400s. This is a very loose system. Feudalism, that's what it is, but it worked, and it worked for a long time. And it is not until governments, if you will, kings, began to intrude on, if you will, the rights of the people, that all of this idea of what we have today, systems of government and theories of government, and the Magna Carta that comes out of that, and eventually democracy and Senate. It is not until there's conflict between the people and the rulers, disagreements about how to be protected, or more importantly, usually a protector would want to go to the people and get money, taxation. It's not until those arguments develop that this system begins to fall apart. So many people talk about the Dark Ages. The reality is, the Dark Ages, that system of economic and political government worked at a very low system. Now, it is a top-down system. Feudalism is very much a matter of people at the bottom, if you will, working the land, asking for protection from somebody else who is a warlike, or has the skills of warriors, and those people, the warriors, begin to dominate. Now, just so you understand where we're going with this, you have the person at the top who's the warrior, who's the leader, who eventually becomes king. You have his warriors who he rewards with by giving them land. Those are the nobles. They technically own the land. And you have the people underneath who work the land. So serfs, nobles, king. But here's the other reality of that: is it's a loose system in the sense that the nobles are the ones who really are in control, the middle of that group, because they have total authority over their land. And in some cases, they disagree. If they disagree with the king or the warrior, they don't have to give their support. Um, they are kings on their land. Nobility had complete control over their land. And so there's an agreement again, and this is the key point. Kings aren't complete lords over everything. We have to understand that. They don't have total authority, only the authority that the nobility gives them. And the nobles controlled their land. The nobles on their land had more authority than a king. A king had to ask permission to go into the noble's land oftentimes. Look, if you're confused by all of this, all you need to know is it is a loose agreement on how to organize and run society. And here's the reality: is that loose agreement is almost universal throughout the medieval world. That includes the Byzantine Empire, and that includes Europe. We're famous because it's famous. Feudalism is famous because of what comes out of the kings and queens and damsels in distress and the literature of the 1400s and the Renaissance, etc. But the truth is, feudalism had been practiced in the Roman Empire, and it was practiced all the way through the Byzantine Empire, and eventually is practiced all the way through the Ottoman Empire, and exists all the way until the end of World War One. Feudalism, the idea of having serfs who are stuck on land and pledged to a government, it doesn't disappear in Europe until the 1860s, when Russia liberates its serfs, saying, "Man, you're allowed to go somewhere else." So this system is underrated and very important for understanding that human beings, in exchange for food and everything they need to live, in exchange for all goods and services, will give those things without cash. They'll give them to a government for protection, and it just becomes an incredible, kind of loose system that works for thousand years. Yes, it has its hiccups. It has people who try to take advantage of it, um, and eventually the world develops and changes entirely. But it was one of the earliest economic and political systems that seemed to work and generate in itself. Don't get me wrong, church inserts itself into that. By the way, the church was feudal as well. You think about it, it has a top-down system as well. It has the pope, it has bishops in between, and it has the common priest at the bottom, or it has the common citizen at the bottom. So it's all kind of tied in together. And we'll talk more about the church and its structure later. Okay, it's been half an hour. I've babbled enough towards you and at you. Hopefully, you understand the major lessons here related to the barbarian invasion geographically, and then eventually culturally, and its legacy. I'll give you another lecture here shortly that'll be coming up, specifically on the Byzantine Empire and then the Islamic invasions of the 700s. Hope you have a wonderful day, and don't forget to turn in your sheet related to this lecture within a week. Thank you.